Hello, my little flesh bags, and welcome back to A Haunting Relief. My name is Bone Diddley, and I am the host with the most. Bones, that is. Today, I thought I would read to you a haunting story of the past in order to cherish the nightmares for tomorrow. Let me ask you a question, my little flesh bags. When was the last time you read a good ghost story? Let me guess, between the uploads to your OnlyFans account and the sins you keep hidden away from your friends and family, I would imagine it's been a while. Well, my little flesh bags, have no fear because old Bone Diddley is here. And tonight we start the story by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu in his 1872 classic Camilla. Oh, yes, 1872, a time where chlamydia was passed around like cocktail napkins and men could get free vasectomies from riding his horse for too long, and where the women wore panties drier than the Sahara Desert. So sit back and relax and enjoy this haunting relief from your old pal Bone Diddley. The Prologue. Upon a paper attached to the narrative which follows, Dr. Acelius has written a rather elaborate note, which he accompanies with a reference to his essay on the strange subject which the manuscript illuminates. This mysterious subject he treats in that essay with his usual learning and acumen, and with remarkable directness and condensation. It will form but one volume of the series of that extraordinary man's collected papers. As I publish the case in the volume, simply to interest the laity, I shall forestall the intelligent lady, who relates it, in nothing. And after due consideration, I have determined, therefore, to abstain from presenting any precise of the learned doctor's reasoning, or extract from his statement on a subject which he describes as involving, not improbably, some of the profoundest arcana of our dual existence, and its intermediates. I was anxious on discovering this paper to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Acelius so many years before, with a person so clever and careful, and his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found that she died in the interval. She probably could have added a little to the narrative which she communicates in the following pages, with so far as I can pronounce such conscientious particularity. Chapter 1. An Early Fright. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle, or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever much more money would at all materially add to our comforts, or even luxuries. My father was in the Austrian service, and retired upon a pension and his patrimony, and purchased his feudal residence and the small estate on which it stands, a bargain. Nothing could be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in the forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat stocked with perch and sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface white fleets of water lilies. Over all this schloss shows its many windowed fronts, its tower, its Gothic chapel. The forest opens up in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right of the steep Gothic bridge carries a road over a stream that winds in deep shadows through the wood. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether I say is truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited slough of any historic association is that of an old General Spielsdorf nearly 20 miles away to the right. I have said the nearest inhabited village because there is only 3 miles westward, that is to say, in the direction of General Spielsdorf Schloss, a ruined village, with its quaint little church, now roofless, and the aisle of which all the mouldering tombs of the proud family of the Konstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau which, in the thick of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the town. Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend which I shall relate to you another time. I must tell you now how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants, or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the schloss. Listen and wonder. My father, who is the kindest man on earth, but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19, 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the Schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. I cannot remember the time when her fat, benign face was not a familiar picture in my memory. This was Madame Perrodon, a native of Berne, whose care and good nature now in part supplied to me the loss of my mother, whom do I not even remember, so early as I lost her. She made a third out of our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, a lady such as you term, I believe, a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added English, which, partly to prevent its becoming a lost language among us, and partly from patriotic motives, we spoke every day. The consequences was a babel, at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. And there were 2 or 3 young ladies' friends besides us, pretty nearly in my own age, who were occasional visitors for longer or shorter terms, and these visits I sometimes returned. These were our regular social resources, but of course there were chance visits from neighbors, of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, rather a solitary one, I can assure you. My governess had just so much control over me as you might conjecture such sage persons would have in the case of a rather spoiled girl, whose only parents allowed her pretty nearly own way in everything. The first occurrence in my existence, which produced a terrible impression upon my mind, which, in fact, never has been effaced, was one of the very early incidents of my life which I can now recollect. Some people will think of it so trifling that it should not be recorded here. You will see, however, by and by, why I mention it. The nursery, as it was called, though I had it all to myself, was a large in the upper story of the castle, with a steep oak roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old, when one night I awoke, and looking around the room from my bed, failed to see the nursery maid. Neither was the nurse there, and I thought myself alone. I was not frightened, for I was one of those happy children who are studiously kept in ignorance of ghost stories, of fairy tales, and all such lore as to makes us cover up our heads when the door cracks suddenly, or the flicker of expiring candle makes the shadow on the bedpost dance upon the wall, nearer to our faces. I was vexed and insulted in finding myself, as I conceived, neglected, and I began to whimper, preparatory to a hearty bout of roaring, when to my surprise I saw a solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. It was that of a young lady who was kneeling, with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind pleased wonder, and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands, and lay down beside me on the bed, and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully soothed, and fell asleep again. I was wakened by a sensation as if 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly. The lady started back, with her eyes fixed on me, and then slipped down upon the floor, as I thought, hid herself under the bed. I was now for the first time frightened, and I yelled with all my might and main. Nurse, nursery maid, housekeeper all came running in, and hearing my story, they made light of it, soothing me all they could meanwhile. But child as I was, I could perceive that their faces were pale with the unwonted look of anxiety, and I saw them look under the bed and about the room, and peep under tables and pluck open cupboards, and the housekeeper whispered to the nurse, "Lay your hand along the hollow in the bed. Someone did lie there. So sure as you did not, that place is still warm." I remember the nursery maid petting me, and all three examining my chest where I told them I felt the puncture, and pronouncing that there was no sign visible that any such thing had happened to me. The housekeeper and the other two servants, who were in charge of the nursery, remained sitting up all night, and from that time a servant remained always sat up in the nursery until I was about 14. I was very nervous for a long time after this. A doctor was called in. He was pallid and elderly. How well I remembered his long saturnine face, slightly pitted with smallpox, and his chestnut wig. For a good while, every second day, he came in me and gave me medicine, which of course I hated. The morning after I saw this apparition, I was in a state of terror and could not bear to be left alone, daylight though it was, for a moment. I remember my father coming up and standing at the bedside, and talking cheerfully, and asking the nurse a number of questions, and laughing very heartily at one of the answers, and patting me on the shoulder, and kissing me, and telling me not to be frightened, that it was nothing but a damn dream, and it could not hurt me. But I was not comforted, for I knew the visit of the strange woman was not a dream, and I was awfully frightened. I was a little consoled by the nursery maid's assuring me that it was she who had come and looked at me, and lain down beside me in the bed, and that I must have been half dreaming not to have known her face. But this, although supported by the nurse, did not quite satisfy me. I remember in the course of that day a venerable old man in a black cassock coming into the room with the nurse and housekeeper, and talking a little to them. Very kindly to me. His face was very sweet and gentle, and he told me they were going to pray, and joined hands together, and desired me to say softly, while they were praying, "Lord, hear all good prayers for us, for Jesus' sake." I think these were the very words, for I often repeated them to myself, and my nurse used to make me say them for years afterwards in my prayers. I remembered so well the thoughtful sweet face of that white-haired old man in the black cassock, as he stood in that rude, lofty brown room, with the clumsy furniture of a fashion 300 years old about him, the scantly light entering the shadowy atmosphere through the small lattice. He kneeled, and the three women with him, and he prayed loud with the earnest, quavering voice, what appeared to me a long time. I forgot all my life preceding that event, and for some time after it, all its obscureness also. But the scenes I have just described stand out as vivid and isolated pictures of the phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. Well, well, my little flesh bags, let's take a pause right there. And that will be the end of our episode for today. I already know some of you are eyeballing your phone, itching to check that next feed on your social media accounts. But have no fear, I'll be back real soon to continue this tale and find out what lies underneath our main character's bed. This is your old pal Bone Diddley signing off, reminding you that the only thing scarier than this show is your own reality. Ta-ta!